The first reading for this 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time tells the story of a Shunammite woman and the prophet Elisha. It is a story that shows how we are involved in God's plan of salvation, how each of us has a role to fulfill. Elisha is a prophet. He's called by God. He has a mission from God. But it's this Shunammite woman who recognizes his mission and makes room for him in her house and enables him to preach the word. I'd like to tell you a story about another woman who also made a space for God in her life and in her world. The story takes place in the southern United States, where there can be a lot of racism. A white woman was having problems with her washing machine, and she called a repair service. A black man, a service technician, came to her house, and while he was repairing the washing machine, she started talking to him. She particularly asked him how he felt now in this political climate where there's so much interest and concern and so many demonstrations about racial inequality. She asked what was his personal experience. He replied that his experience had been quite bad, that when he went to people's homes, sometimes he was called derogatory names. He said he gets stopped 5 or 6 times a year by the police just because he's black. He said he can't take any appointments after dark because so often he gets stopped by the police who see him driving to a service call in the dark. Carolyn, the woman in the story, learned so much from her discussions with the black repairman. She finally began to understand what racial injustice and persecution and discrimination really meant. She learned what the scriptures are teaching us when they talk about injustice. She wrote up her experience and with his permission put it on Facebook, and her account has been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. She enabled God's voice. She enabled God's message to be heard. Probably most of us, if we ask how God found a space in our lives, can trace an important part of our religious history back to some person. Maybe it's a parent who helped us to learn the words of our prayers. Or maybe we saw our parents working with a troublesome neighbor and learned about relationships. Or maybe it was a grandmother who taught us about the things that are important in life, and especially about respecting the things of God. Or maybe it was some teacher or a retreat leader who helped us to really find religious values in our lives. For me, it was a priest named Gene Walsh. He was my spiritual director in the seminary, and he really helped me to understand God as much as we can, and to understand what God wanted me to do. We can expect Christ to come in many, many disguises. He can come as a stranger, as an outcast, as an inconvenient friend, as a sick relative, as a washing machine repairman. So many appearances of God in our lives seem to be accidental and unplanned. But those appearances of God, other people bringing God to us, that's what baptism is asking us to do, to create places where God can appear. That's what Jesus did. Jesus went about preaching and teaching, and he showed people of his time that God appears in different ways, ways that were different from what they expected, ways that were different from what the religious leaders then were teaching them. In baptism, we make a decision to follow Jesus and to do what he did, to help other people to discover God in their lives. We make a commitment to be an agent of God's presence in the world. We need to create spaces in our lives for Christ and for his message. That's what the woman in the United States did when she welcomed the repairman. She created a space for God's love and life and values to be made known. The problem is our lives are so busy, there are so many distractions. We really need to be deliberate in creating the doorways through which God can enter our lives. How do we do that? How do we create those spaces for God? Maybe it's taking time, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, just to sit and talk to God. Maybe it's taking the time to listen to an obnoxious colleague at work. Maybe it's creating a new awareness and an understanding of racial inequality. If you'd like to follow up more on that story about the repairman and the white woman, you can get the link to that on our newsletter that we send out by email or on our Facebook page. Maybe you can create a space for God by giving some money to an organization that's promoting justice. Maybe you can take part in a demonstration for women's rights or against domestic violence. Maybe it's just giving a smile or a drink of water to the Agi woman who comes by your house. Or maybe it's sticking out your neck to heal a strained relationship in your family. Or maybe it's being the first to say, "Of course I forgive you." Or maybe it's speaking out at a meeting to defend the rights of undocumented people, or the people who don't have much, who are really poor, don't any land. St. Paul today, in our second reading, speaks about our sins dying with Christ, and then our rising with Christ in baptism. Our sins go into the tomb with Christ and they die, but we come out of the tomb with Christ and we receive a newness of life. And now we are supposed to, after baptism, see our lives from a different perspective, with a different viewpoint. Christ wishes that for us. He wants us to see things with new eyes, and we must make it happen with our deliberate choices. We must make a space for God to appear. We have to find God where he comes, when he comes, and we have to make him visible to others through our words and our actions.